Hi there, Frank Winston here from the Pacifica Historical Society and host of the program Footprints of Pacifica, where we explore the history of Pacifica, the lure and the lore of the city, and what it is that brings the people here and what they find from studying our history. This show will talk about the earliest residents of this village, town, city, the Ohlone people. We have a guest, Shirley Drye, who is a resident of Pacifica and has long studied the archaeology and the customs of the people that we look at. We start first with a video of the Ohlones and some of their artifacts with Shirley.
This is a clapstick, and this is the sound the Ohlone people who lived here before the arrival of the Spanish would have heard when they danced. You can see it's embellished and decorated with the olivella and the abalone shells that you find locally. This is what most of their jewelry, like my earrings. They would have had earrings like this. And they did dance. All of these things on the table here are mementos of their lifetime here. The shells are all local, everything. The bent-nosed clam, the abalone, the oyster shell, all these were picked up off of our beaches. The mussel shells, all these things had something to eat in them. And that's one of the things I like to emphasize is their source of food, which was really abundant here. No question about that. They might have had to go across the hill to gather the acorns, which were their staple. And these were the people who were living right here on the adobe grounds in a village that they called Pruristak. Kind of a tongue twister, Pruristak. And we have an abundance of midden material, which is really their garbage dump. And this is also where they buried their dead, because the soil was friable, because so much organic material was in it. They had tools. One of them was a hammerstone, which they would have used. This is a piece of obsidian, which is volcanic glass, and most of their arrowheads were made out of this, and they would have used a hammerstone. Whoa, I just knocked a piece off. To knock off large pieces, and then they would have taken a smaller tool called an awl. This was made by a Copeño Indian from Southern California, and they would have done the finishing work on their arrowheads, which the majority of these are made of obsidian. But the local people had to import obsidian. So they also used this. A ranger brought me this. This would be the butt end, the one that goes into the spear, and the working end would have been up here. And this looks like serpentine, and this was one my son dug up out of our backyard. So you know, and people brought me points from, this is one that was brought to me by people who found it above Cabrillo School. This one also, this one. These two were found at the quarry before they built that big berm. That berm is not natural. Caltrans built it. This is an obsidian bird point. And this is a scraper. The end is broken off here. And this is Monterey chert, which was highly valued. And this would have been a scraper for scraping like fur off of a skin. For a number of uses, they had scrapers. They also loved to play games. This was one of their big gambling games. These are called gambling sticks, and they would have dropped these straight down onto a flat surface, and depending on how they fell, they would get game counting sticks or points. Now, if they came half design side up and half right side up, they would get one counting stick. And if they were all design side up, they might get 2. And if they were plain side up, they would get 3. But they could make the rules up as they went. Although that's pretty close to the way the native people tell me. And so you would win these game counting sticks. And it's a game that went on like the card game War that children love to play. You play until one person has all the counting sticks. And this is very few. There might be a great many more counting sticks. And their other favorite game was one that we like to play. Hide behind your hands, and I put my hands out, and you guess which one it's in. And they will play that for hours. Rock artifacts. This is a charm stone. And you know, even the Ohlone people are not entirely certain of what the charm stone, what function it was, but it appears as if they would have worn it like we would have worn a cross or a chai or some religious symbol. And they also found them hanging in places where it looked like it might have been perhaps a very spiritual place to them, or even perhaps to promote good fishing. They might have been good luck. And this one, interestingly, was found on the grounds here, and it's shaped like a woman's breast. And most of my archaeologist friends just laugh, but I don't know what else it could be, but you can all recognize this one. And the men archaeologists get very solemn when they see one in that shape, which is a phallus. Let's see, what else do we have here? Cooking. I'm a woman, and I do really like to emphasize food and cooking. And as many of you probably have heard, they cooked in baskets. And that always raises the question of what kept the basket from burning. Well, they didn't put the basket on the fire. They heated rocks, somewhat like this, in a fire. And then they would lift them out and put them into the basket of cornmeal, which was well ground and had water added to it. And they would stir this rock around to keep it from burning the bottom of the basket and take it out when the rocks cooled. And it didn't take very long to cook the acorn meal, and I've eaten acorn meal many times. They had wonderful plants here. It's a plant that has a bulb that sits inside brown fibers. And as you might guess from its name, soaproot, for those of you who are technically minded, it's Chlorogallum pomeridianum. And it's onion-like in there. And the Ohlone would take that out, and it just makes a wonderful lather. And I have showered and shampooed my hair with it, so I know that it's true. You can also cook it and eat it, of all things. And it tastes like a mild potato. And of course I've done that also. And then you can mash up that cooked soaproot and get all the fibers out. It's sort of like when you eat it like artichoke. You have to pull the fibers through your teeth. And then pack the soft substance around the end of the fibers, and lo and behold, it hardens like plastic. They also could use it to make their arrowheads stick to the shaft. You can see how hard that is. Isn't that a marvelous plant? They could spread it over their bodies, and it gives them some resistance to insect bites. They could also take the cooked one, mashed up, put it in an eddy in the stream, and instead of standing all day with a hook and line, they just went in and picked the fish up because it stunned the fish. Now, they were smart enough not to put this in across a stream bed, because then they wouldn't have any fish next season if they killed the whole run. So they were very judicious in their use of and care of the environment, more so than certainly than we were. They also made beautiful baskets. This is very old, and this is an Ohlone basket. You can see it's decorated with shells. These are probably, could be Washington clam shells, and the basket is twined. Now the Ohlone, we needed to have a twine basket. This is coiled, because the Ohlone made mostly twine baskets. In terms of food, they virtually lived in a Garden of Eden. I can find food without trapping. I can find food all year long growing on the land. And some of it on the headlands is even pre-salted from the spindrift. So it's a wonderful place to live. And every era of California history has had population here. This is how good Pacifica is. We're all very fortunate to live here, and the Ohlone people knew that also. For us, we had all the tules. So the tules made their houses and their boats and made rope, and the ladies' skirts were split tules. Maybe we'll see some pictures of that in a bit. But the tule was a wonderful, let's see, I have a piece here. Tule is a sedge. And sedges are wedges, so the tule is triangular in shape and has a soft center. I had a naturalist who called it nature's styrofoam, because it makes wonderful seating pads. And the tule that grows big like you have in the golf course, they'll be this big. And you can imagine if you made a mat out of that, you've got a nice seating. And this was just like the soapwood. It was so useful. And then you look at this and you wonder, what's that made out of? Creek willow, which grows all over Pacifica. And only the deer seem to understand the real value of the creek willow. Now the Ohlone people used, all over California, they used the creek willow for their basketry. The basis of this is creek willow. And the Indians were smart. They would husband their trees by coppicing them each year. That's cutting them off low, and then they put out long straight shoots for next year's basketry, and eventually for the framework for their houses and their boats. And this wonderful plant has qualities that are just absolutely unique that the majority of the world doesn't know about. The bark is loaded with aspirin. So you might ask, well, here we go. We've got people who have the ability to control fevers and pain just by chewing creek willow bark. We'll have to take a look at a creek willow. It grows all over around us, everywhere. So they had a tree that gave them frameworks for their houses, their baskets, their boats. They could chew the bark or make a willow bark tea for pain or for to reduce temperature. And there's even a fiber inside the bark when the sap is up that is a white fiber that you can make string from. And they did have to go over the hill to collect their acorns. And they had to hunt and gather for game. We know that. But they had semi-permanent villages. As a result, the experts in the field a number of years ago found a name for them. Tribe doesn't fit, because tribe is a form of social organization with a chief and a council of elders and your shaman, you know, your doctors, healers, priests, all wrapped up into one as a shaman. And these people had a head man. Sometimes they had a council of elders, but they didn't quite have a tribal structure. So the word to describe their social organization is tribelet. And that is the way we should refer to them. Or as bands. Either one will fit, because they do seem to have had a band structure at that time the Spanish arrived. These people did gather, and they had an ingenious way of getting the word out. They would take a piece of rope and they would tie knots into it. And the runner, they did have runners from village to village, they also had traders, and he would take one of these ropes to the next group, and it would have the number of knots on it from the days, for the number of days before the gathering occurred. And even among the Ohlone people, they spoke about 8 different languages. The interesting thing was they were all a part of the Penutian language family, but they could not necessarily understand their neighbor. And a person in the organization, their social organization, would be a speaker. And he could speak probably the languages of the groups around him. So we call it a shellmid. We also have a lot of ceramic from the Spanish-Mexican era and the American era. And but the shell is of interest to us today because this is a residue from the Ohlone period for the most part. Red elderberries. The Ohlone people call this the music bush because the center of these are pithy and they could make flutes out of the material. They also made some of their game sticks out of these. This is the Ohlone sweetgrass. And I don't want to get into too much of a discussion, but this is my understanding, and some of the native people have told me, others dispute it. It's an aromatic. You squish the leaf, and it has a beautiful scent. And they would use this, dry it, roll it into balls, dry it, and then light it, and it's sort of like an incense. But that's soapwood. This is the big straight leaf soapwood. Fiber that they put around the ends of the fibers to make a whisk broom also was used to make the arrows stick to the shaft. They'd also put sinew around to hold it in place, but it had, you know, any use you can put to something of that quality, because it hardens just like plastic. So it was a great plant, a wonderful. Oh, and the young greens, not only did the deer like to eat them, but the Ohlone would eat them. This is San Pedro Valley Creek, and it runs from the ocean all the way back in San Pedro Valley Park, and it has several branches. And this creek would have been used by the Ohlone for bathing water, cooking water, because it's good and fresh, even up this far from the ocean. It's not too far, but it still isn't salty here. And they would have taken fish from the creek. What else? Bathing. And they would have had a sweat house, which the Ohlone people did have, very close to the creek bed, so the men could go in and sweat and then jump into the cold water. And I've been told that among the Ohlone, women did go into the sweat house. So they sound like good people, because in some societies in California, the women didn't go into the sweat house. And a lot of what you're seeing is native. These are creek willows across the way, and alders and elderberry. We still have a good run of our steelhead in here. They hunted the deer with bows and arrows, and their bows and arrows were not really strong enough to bring down a deer, so they had a lot of preparation. They went into the sweat house for 3 days and fasted. And what they're doing is getting rid of their human smell, because it's the food we eat that make us smell. And once out of the sweat house after 3 days, they would have rubbed their body with deer fat and maybe herbs, so they smelled like the deer, because they had to stalk their prey. They couldn't stand back 100 yards or 50 yards and shoot it. They had to get up fairly close. So they would also put on a deer head and drape the skin over their shoulders, and they made all the same motions as the deer, so they could get very close and bring it down. And they were so good at this that the Spanish occasionally took shots at the Ohlone people thinking they were deer. So it gives you an idea of how effective they were.
Back in the studio, Shirley, thanks for coming back to us, and tell us, you know so much about that, but when you came to Pacifica, when did you come to Pacifica?
1958.
And what did you know at that time about the archaeology and the history of Pacifica?
Nothing.
Okay, and how did you train for this particular talent?
I had become very interested in archaeology at an earlier time, and needed to finish college, and made the decision to major in anthropology with a special area of interest would be archaeology. And while I was, one of the first things you take is a course called California Archaeology, not very unique. And in that you learn all about the native people, the names of the various language groups, and their lifeways. And very quickly I was asked to do a program in the San Francisco Public Schools. And
on the archaeology of California, or this particular area?
On the native people.
Okay.
They had a trunk out of the museum at San Francisco State, you know, a big box that I took into the school. And also I was already working at the Sanchez Adobe. I was a docent there. And we had a history of the Ohlone people there, because there was the village of Puristac at the Adobe. And it seemed reasonable that we should develop a program on the Ohlone at the Adobe.
Well, if we look back at the Ohlones, how far back do we go in the Pacifica region or by the coast here?
Well, probably to about 2000 BP, that's 2,000 years ago, here in Pacifica. I'm not going to put that any earlier, although certainly the Ohlone were here long before that in this area.
Do we know where they came from?
They were a part of the people that appear to have come over the land bridge during the last ice age, when there was a land bridge between Russia and Alaska, and is now the Bering Straits. And they appear to have entered California through the Great Basin as it dried up. It had been a very large area of water. And when that began to dry up, it looks like the native people began to pour into California. And there's also some evidence that they came down from the north, from Oregon.
And now, in the 1700s, the Spanish came to explore, totally unexpecting who they would meet, but they met up with the Ohlones as well.
Yes, they did.
And how was their relationship, and how did it happen?
Very typical of all of California. They encountered the native people, and they built Mission Dolores, and they herded the native people into the mission, and their goal was to teach them pastoralism and convert them to Catholicism or to Christianity, and then to leave pastoral communities and return to their to Spain or to Mexico. And it just didn't happen that way.
What did happen when the Spanish came here?
Well, of course, they indentured the native people to build the missions, and they brought them into the mission in large numbers.
Well, excuse me, you used the word indentured. Did they force them to do it? Was it gun battles? Did they, because they were teaching them the prayer and the religion that they adopted? Just how strong were they?
Initially, I think the native people were very fascinated with an advanced technology. Our comparison is if we had visitors from outer space who brought us some new technology, we would be excited too. And so initially it does appear that there was a lot of willingness among the native people to come into the missions. And they began to recognize at some point that they were losing their own, the best way I can address this, people wonder why they didn't leave. Dr. Hooper down at Mission San Antone, he describes the mission there as having 2,000 native people and 2 priests and about 6 soldiers. And he said that if the native people wanted to leave, there was very little that they could have done to stop them. So clearly we have an element of their willingness to learn new ways and to participate in this. In some places they didn't. It's very human in the sense that it varied all over the state of California, from outright rebellion to acquiescence.
You mentioned Mission Dolores. Did that have a special role with regard to the people indigenous to this area of Pacifica?
Yes. We have evidence that from the archaeological work that's been done at the adobe, that leadership among the native people at Mission Dolores was provided from our village at the Sanchez adobe. The name of that village was Puristac.
Sanchez, was that initially a mission or attempted to be a mission?
No, it had been originally the Ohlone village, and because of it's a beautiful ecotone right there, which is a confluence of sources: the creek, the ocean, the marsh, the valley, the mountains, the game, the plants. They had many sources to draw from for food, for sustenance. And what was your question?
My question was the Mission Dolores took advantage of that
yes,
opportunity.
Yes, they did. When Father Crespi came through, they did camp there, and he described the valley as fertile and well-watered and ideal for a mission, except that there was no lumber. Our trees were all scrub community trees and didn't provide lumber. But when they needed to build a farm, they came back here. I said that the mission was built on sand dunes, and they couldn't grow enough food, and so they came and built it's often called a mission outpost. I like to call it a support farm, and that matches the word that the Spanish called it, which was asistencia, which is like assistance farm.
Mm-hmm.
And we only were able to call it that because there was a chapel there. So some mission
in Pacifica.
Yeah, at the asistencia, at the adobe. And that meant that there was some mission activity there.
Speaking of those terms, what did the Spaniards call the Indians? They weren't called the Adobes, the Ohlones. And then also, where did the term Ohlones come from?
Well, the Spanish came and encountered these people living along the coast, and they gave them the name Costeño, which is Spanish for people of the coast, I've been told. I think that's correct. And the Americans corrupted that to Costanoan, and so many of us are accustomed to hearing the term Costanoan. But the Ohlone people felt again that that was a Spanish name given to them, and that they preferred to have a name of their own.
But during this time, we're talking about 1700, 1800, the American period, when did they really adopt the name Ohlones?
No more than about 30 or 40 years ago.
How did that come about?
They got together and decided on a name. And I'm not really knowledgeable about why they chose that one.
But that existed. Yeah. There were Ohlone
it existed
tribes
as a name. Yes,
Ohlone groups elsewhere.
And for some reason, that name appealed to them, and they took that as the name of the people who lived here on the peninsula in the East Bay, south as far as Hollister and Monterey Bay, just a little bit south of Monterey Bay also. And I think the eastern line was the foothills somewhere around State Park. And it's a large area. And all the people in that area gather together and assume the name Ohlone.
Now, that was just 30 years ago.
30 or 40 years ago, they assumed. And I wish I could tell you more detail about how they chose that name.
Well, it's probably was political for all we know.
It could have been.
Some group wanted to influence some other group.
But you also have to understand that within the Ohlone people, there are the Rumsian, there are the Mwekma. There are a variety of names that the individual groups, they'll call themselves Rumsian Ohlone.
Where are we today in
Ohlone.
Pacifica? Are there Ohlones here, or have they all disbanded, or they intermarried with the Spanish, the American?
All of that.
All of that.
All of the above.
So how many, if we took a population count as an archaeologist, where would we be today?
I can't answer that question.
There's very few.
There's one woman living here in Pacifica who is Ohlone, but I don't think her roots are with the Ohlone people of the Pacifica area. When you ask how many, when I go to a gathering, often there is 100 or more people there.
Now, where's the gathering? Is that of Ohlones?
Coyote Hills, yeah. Every first Sunday in October, the Ohlone people gather at Coyote Hills across the bay. It's a lovely place to go. And you can see their dancing and experience all of their native technology that I showed on the film that you saw.
Well, Shirley, we're really grateful that you would be with us today to share that. I'm sorry their time has run out and we must end the show, but we hope people could still see you they could visit the site and learn more again at the Adobe Sanchez Historical Site.
Frank, I'm not an Indian. I have to tell you that. I'm not a native Californian.
Don't have to be to have the love that you have for the people.
Thank you.
Going to sign off for now, and remember that lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and in parting leave behind us footprints in the sands of time.